The organization that is in charge of handling the extraterrestrial presence on Earth and keeping the knowledge classified since at least 1947 is called Majestic. The origins of the Majestic 12, as it is called, have their roots in the July 1947 crash of several ET vehicles in and around Roswell, New Mexico. President Truman established the Majestic 12 Committee, and they were formally inaugurated in September 1947. The original members are as follows.
The Majestic 12 is a group of scientists and scientific advisors who work for the Committee of the Majority. Now, I have had occasion, when I was involved with Aquarius, to have to send to the so-called Majestic 12 the documents to which you were privy, the leaked material from my deceased friends. And I had association with them on that level. One of the Majestic 12, or I should say was alleged to be a member of the Majestic 12, was present at the Clean Sphere when I was in the Clean Sphere. I've mentioned his name before. This again may be risking the cause of my freedom because of the very problems we face now as a society. So I've got to be careful about that, whether or not that sacrifices my freedom. His first name is Vignev. As far as I will go from there.
At a secret location in Las Vegas, Mark McCandlish continues his in-depth interview of Dan Burish, a government-sanctioned whistleblower extraordinaire, about the alien cover-up at the most secret base, Area 51, called S4, at the Nevada test site.
I was then taken for the first time to Groom Lake for testing, and this was bizarre. I was originally taken, the first flight was in fact out of the Janet terminal. I was taken to the Hughes Executive Air Terminal.
This is McCarran Airport in Las Vegas?
Yes. We were picked up. I was told by Sam that I would receive a series of tone codes and they would give me a name. Well, in a time. I'd be picked up outside and my mom and my dad would regularly see me. In fact, as this was going on, get picked up outside the apartment on Channel 10 Drive, saluted by U.S. Air Force, who they had stripes and they were in a normal
enlisted men.
Right, and placed in the back of a small sedan, black sedan, and would be transported over to the Hughes Executive Terminal. I was then escorted in to a gentleman at a podium. From there, I was given a license plate number. I had to show my ID and all of that business. I had my ID with me.
Were these like randomly chosen, but actual license plate numbers?
That I don't know.
Okay.
That I don't know. But they read with the 3 letters, 3 numbers, like a standard Nevada license plate.
In 2004, Ron Garner, Stargate producer, introduced Linda Howe, UFO researcher, to Doreen Crane, Dan's mother in Las Vegas. Linda continued her investigation into the Dan Burish story. Pictured here is Linda with Dan at Frenchman's Mountain outside of Las Vegas. The following interview took place on the Coast to Coast radio program on February the 10th, 2006, with George Norrie, Linda Howe, and Doreen Crane. Doreen confirms her son's story about being given a secret code, being picked up at their home, and seeing him board a Janet jet at McCarran Airport in Las Vegas.
Linda, let's talk a little bit now, if you can. First of all, before we go to Dodie, tell us about Dan Burish. There are a lot of new people that come to Coast, and they're saying, who is this person? So I'll let you explain that.
Well, I was hoping I could kill 2 birds with 1 stone and actually start with his mother and come up chronologically so that we can see a kind of flow here.
All right.
Dodie Crane, as she's known to people, was born Doreen LaPierre Crane on July 28, 1939, which makes her 66 years old today. She married her husband John Crane 44 years ago on December 31st, 1961, and 3 years later, Danny B. Crane was born on February 2nd at St. Francis Hospital in Linwood, California. 22 years later, On December 24th, 1986, Danny B. Crane received a BA from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, after spending a youth with great intense focus on microbiology. That I have established myself in talking with people and mentors who knew him during his young years and in high school. Then in 1988 to 1989, according to Doreen Crane, her son Danny, quote, received money from the United States Navy for work to get his PhD in microbiology at State University of New York, Stony Brook, unquote. Dodie Crane said the PhD diploma certificate arrived in the mail at the John and Doreen Crane home in Las Vegas on February 5th, 1990. John Crane says he put it in a frame and he nailed it to the living room wall. And now as we speak, in 2006 February, Dan Burish is now 42 years old, and he has not seen either of his parents since October 5th, 1993. Dan Burish told me a year or so ago that he did work on a top secret MJ-12 project for the United States Navy that took him into, specifically, Area 51 S4 between 1989 and 1994. He says that's the only relevant time of his story. While he was there, he allegedly worked in a clean sphere with an EBIN, one of these extraterrestrial biological entities, on a medical project. I think it was on Coast a year ago. Amid the increasing amount of smoke and confusion around the Dan Burish story, I told you that as much smoke as there was, I still thought that there was some fire there, and I still do based on some of my own independent research, but it is without doubt one of the most controversial sagas in the whole history of the UFO phenomenon, and nothing really has been proved. And I wondered, George, if we could start out by introducing Doreen Crane and asking her what she thinks is the strongest evidence as his mother that she knows personally that convinces her that Dan worked for at least a period of time for the United States government.
Sure thing. Doreen's with us now. Hi, Doreen.
Hi. You can call me Dodie.
Okay, Dodie. I'm going to let you and Linda chat for a while because she is indeed a better expert than I ever will be in this particular case, and I will just muddy it up. So go ahead, Linda.
Okay. Hi, Dodie.
Hi. How you doing?
What has convinced you as his mother from being around him before he left your house and never returned? What specifically, the phone codes, the cars, tell this audience about what you know personally.
Okay. First of all, I forgot to mention to you when I was talking to you about a W-2 form from the U.S. Naval Intelligence that John used to make Danny's taxes. And we had a W-2 form, but of course they were attached to Danny's copies and stuff, and he took those with him when he left home.
But you're saying your husband personally saw a W-2 Navy form because he did your son's taxes?
Yes, and I seen it too, because I used to sit around with John when we did the taxes.
Okay. Now, talk about the phone.
Okay, the phone calls. When Danny was living at home, he got picked up with the Navy, got involved with the U.S. Naval Intelligence at UNLV. Then he came home one day and told us that he had signed a piece of paper that he was going to be helping the Naval Intelligence at Area 51. And he was 18 years old. We almost blew our stack because he had signed a paper. Secondly, after that, phone calls kept coming into our home, and they'd ask for Danny, and I would give them to Danny, and Danny would punch in a code, and then either he would call back or they would, at that time, tell him where to go, either at Nellis or at McCarran.
What is your firsthand knowledge about either helping him, driving him, or checking on cars? How do you know that he ever went to McCarran or Nellis?
Well, first of all, 18, 19 years old, you kind of wonder what's going on. So couple of times I followed him when he had his own car. I was a little leery you know, like everybody else. You never know. But it was true. He was going to Nellis. His dad drove him to Nellis also, and he was going to McCarran. And one day he told me that if I would go by Hughes Airport near McCarran, that I would see him get on the Janus airline. And I did. I seen him get on.
And the Janus airplane is supposed to be the small one to fly scientists out to Area 51S4.
Correct. He told me, he said, Mom, if you want to see this, you know, come on over and see it. And I drove by and I waited a few minutes and I watched him get on the plane. And it was my son getting on the plane.
Dodie, would you say it is fair on this February 10th, 2006 night to say that neither you nor your husband nor anyone right now has anything that would stand up as solid proof that Dan B. Crane Burrish worked with an extraterrestrial biological entity in a sphere at Area 51S4?
Well, let me put it this way. I brought up my son not to lie, and he told his dad and I a couple of times that he had done just that. And I believed him because I believed what I seen with my own eyes and how he was being picked up. He got picked up by U.S. Naval and right in front of our home, and I believe him.
From there, I would take that. I was escorted out onto the tarmac, up an external ramp,
A rolling
staircase, into the Janet flight. And I could see that it was a white. Yeah, there was a 737 Boeing. They had no markings on them except for I remember seeing some number details as I walked by the cockpit one time. Some number details to the bottom right of the co-pilot. Okay. The right side would be the co-pilot's. Yes. And aside from that, a red stripe, and there was nothing up on the tail that I noticed, the stabilizer fin.
What was the inside of the aircraft like?
The ones that I were in, it was a slate gray, and they had paps over the seats that had stripes on them.
Uh-huh. Any baggage or bins above?
There were baggage bins, but I never saw them accessed.
Okay.
And so I would be brought into the aircraft and taken back to the tail of the plane. And then I could see and I could hear other folks loading in up front, and a drape would be pulled. And I was told ultimately by one of the male enlisted personnel who were actually, there was a U.S. Air Force actually on board this aircraft, that those were engineers for Groom Lake, and you're here, they're there, and never the twain shall meet. And this was especially during the first time. Things relaxed a little bit as time went on, when I was meeting with other team members, and we would go from there or go from McCarran. But it didn't, it never totally relaxed. There was always that wall between we and they. From there, we got close a couple times, sitting behind the other engineers, but sure. Just close. We wanted to hear.
Of course, curiosity, natural curiosity. Yeah.
They didn't have the same curiosity about us. I don't even know if they knew that we were there, but that we were just disinterested or not interesting to them. But the aircraft taxied, took off. Not that many minutes later, a few minutes. That's what it seemed like. The captain would normally turn on the PA system in the flights, where we could hear him actually communicating with ground control, and there was no music playing at the time when the PA would come on. That would automatically cut off. And later on, I had mentioned that Neil Diamond's "Coming to America." I love the song, Neil, I love you, but over and over and over again, it gets kind of
like a closed loop.
Mm-hmm.
Would they play the whole song, or was it just the phrase "Coming to America"?
It was the whole song.
Okay, well, at least that's something.
That helped. No, it was the whole song. Oh God, over and over again. Anyway, that would be bad. But I would hear them call pyramid, pyramid, pyramid.
That was a call sign?
Well, that was something that I think the pilot may have been communicating with Groom Ground Control.
Okay.
confirming that whatever I think maybe I'm guessing here, whatever the identifier was from their ground control for the aircraft, whatever tag they had or whatever on their
So he was
radar.
addressing the GCI.
I believe so.
Okay, so he
I
would
believe
say
so.
pyramid, pyramid,
Pyramid, and then we would do this sort of a bank. It was a heavy left bank, and then we would descend into the Groom complex, taxi off to the right-hand side, then there was a left turn, and then we would move over to the right. So it was land, right, left, and a move over to the right.
So were you coming in from the north, or were you able to discern?
Oh, I don't know.
Because if you
To be honest with you, I don't know.
Being somewhat familiar with the layout of Groom Lake, the main runway runs north and south.
Yes.
Almost.
Yeah, it would have had to have been from that way. So when we were making the left-hand bank, we were making a
sweeping 180-degree turn.
A sweeping 180 turn to go from south from north to south.
Okay.
That would make sense.
So that would mean then that you were probably flying along the eastern margin of the Nellis test range, and then came in and came around from the northeast, and then banked in.
That would make sense.
And made a landing from the north into the airport.
That would make sense from the banking that we did.
But of course, on the other side of that, the long dirt road that leads from the mailbox up there off of the so-called extraterrestrial highway, that would have taken the Janet flight right over that area to come in on its final approach, wouldn't it? And I don't think I've
never seen the mailbox.
Yeah, well, I've only been up there once myself, but
I've heard about it.
It just seems to me that a lot of the early debunkers were saying that some of the things that people had seen and that they thought were UFOs were actually just the landing lights for the Janet flights making their approach.
Well, it's possible, and there was jokes going on at the time. This was after Bob Lazar's outing, when everybody got very tense, very paranoid up there, and there was a definite reaction. So I can tell that Bob's story, this may be a little bit of verification for him. I can tell that his story by evidence is accurate because of the accuracy of the Galileo Bay at S4.
But the Galileo Bay was which? Was that where the aircraft, the extraterrestrial?
The 4-1, the extraterrestrial and the ARVs.
Okay.
And whatever they had under the tarpaulin that I couldn't see, for sure. But the thing is not only did he have that accurate, which he could have heard from someone, but they wouldn't, in my estimation, have become as paranoid as what they did about badges, identifying, as stiff as what they were acting. And I was hearing that they were acting stiffer than usual.
From
if this guy hadn't been there, right, if this guy hadn't been there. So that provides a degree of verification to me personally that he had been there.
In Bob Lazar's video, Excerpts from the Government Bible, he describes his badge in great detail that allowed him to enter S4 at Area 51.
As you can see in this representation, my ID badge had a white background with one light blue and one dark blue diagonal stripe in the upper left-hand corner. At the bottom of the badge, there were letters and numbers designating various areas, including S4. On my badge, there was a star punch through S4. The back of the ID badge was dark blue with a vertical mag stripe running down one side.
My relationship with Groom Lake was very small. I was taken a couple times after landing off the Janet flights, handing my license plate number, and was taken in a small buggy, almost like a small Jeep, golf cart type.
Was it open or was it closed?
It was open.
Okay.
It was open. And by a couple very large looking hangar, the thing looked like a mountain as we passed by the right hand side of it, and a couple buildings into the left. Was taken inside of a building, was identified by security again, Nellis security. They looked like, they were in cami and they looked like standard enlisted security officers for Air Force.
Okay, you were saying they usually wore camouflage and they had, what, a black beret?
Yes. On the outside. I saw them walking on the outside, and they had black berets. And the gentleman that actually would drive me to that location when I was being driven alone in the buggy, versus when we were actually walked one time with a larger group, but when we were driving in the buggy, the gentleman had it was a standard security officers.
Desert
It
camouflage.
was desert cami. Yeah.
With a black beret, and then you said that when they would go inside the buildings, they would fold the beret and tuck it under one of the epaulets.
Under
on
the
the
epaulets,
shoulder?
yes, upon the left shoulder.
Okay.
Now, the SEALs did the same thing at S4, except for you couldn't see it as well. I mean, these guys were all black there. But I would then be escorted into this one hangar, and there was a barrier. This is something that's never been spoken about before. There was a barrier inside where it artificially segregated off the hangar. I would check in there, sign my name on a log, and he would do the date and time in. The license plate would then be handed by the security officer who picked me up outside of the Janet flight to this security officer. He would say, okay, and then we would go walk down a short corridor, part of this artificial barrier, to the right-hand side, make a left through a doorway, and then the personnel, there were no security-looking personnel present, and there was an elevator there. We went down the elevator, I believe a couple floors. They were paranoid about floors, both at Groom and at S4. Absolutely paranoid about the numbers of the floors. The security officer who picked me up is the one that actually escorted me into the elevator.
Okay.
And they had the same motion every time. Both the SEALs did at S4 as well as the standard security, so I don't know, they may have been the same thing, but wearing different clothing. And what they would do is they would come into the elevator and they would tuck in. Now, the numbers on the outside of the elevator, there were no numbers.
Okay.
So I couldn't see a 1, 2, 3, 4 or anything like that.
Okay.
We would go into the elevator, which was just a shiny steel doors.
Would they actually just close like this, or were they bypass doors where there was one and then another?
No, they would just, as a normal elevator there.
Okay.
We had a different series of situations at S4, and we're going to get to the doorways there, because we actually had lift doors there.
Really?
Especially the ones in the decon between.
Like on the old warehouse?
Well, there were plexiglass. There were plexiglass, and there were air curtains on both sides of them.
Okay.
And so they would lift up out of the floor or drop down when you would move from one decon setting to another, from BL1 to BL2, for instance, as you were being further deconned and bunnied up.
Okay. Now, when you say air curtain, what is an air curtain?
Well, it was a projection, a lengthwise projection of air going upward, and the air curtain acts as an interference for the passing of particulates from one location to another.
Okay. Good.
And they were set up in the past level 2 positive pressure areas for levels 3 and 4 and 4, 5. Ostensibly 4, 5. I'm sure that they had something set up down in the ambassadorial suite, but I never got down in there to actually see it. I saw past the scissors a couple times, but that's it. So anyway, I was taken into the laboratory there several times under this same modality, and brought down a couple levels. But the thing about the behavior of the security officers was they would get in and they would put their back to the numbers, which were covered anyway. They had flat covers over the top of them, so there were no numbers. And they'd put their hands behind them, and ostensibly, I guess, count down and go pop, and they'd push a button, and down we would go.
So you never actually knew which floor you were on?
Nope, not initially. It was a few seconds, but depending upon the speed of the elevator, and it's difficult to judge when you're in an elevator, it was 2 or 3 floors down. I was brought into a standard laboratory environment, a microscopy environment, where there were microscopes sitting on a table. And the questioning by one personnel in there, usually wearing a blue lab coat, began. He would sit opposite me, and I joked with him. I said, I'm used to, when being tested, having a double-headed scope, and that was an actual reference to Jim Reynolds, because when he was teaching me originally at Long Beach Memorial, we had an AO double-headed scope,
Now, when you
and he
say
had a pointer.
double-headed, you mean where two people can view into
Binocular
the same...
double.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, a binocular double-headed. He would sit opposite me as you are now, but with a smaller length table. And I was tested a couple times under that scenario where they would bring in a plastic slide box with numbers on the slides, and he'd say, go through them and tell me what you think.
Okay.
And at that point, another male attendant who was wearing a smock come up and back at me and just wire me up with a standard headset.
Okay.
And I would begin viewing through the microscope, load the slides in myself, and
they would record your analysis?
everything, yes.
Okay.
That happened a few times with progressively more difficult slides. And then I would be transported back out buggied onto the jet. Then I would see people load in up in the front.
That was all that happened? You'd go all the way out there, do this little spiel with the microscope, and then you leave?
Yes.
Just that quick?
Yeah, well, 2-3 hours.
Still, that's a rather short stay, though, I guess.
It is. And my stay at Groom at any one time never got longer than that. Yeah, one time I was set out there in a bus for a couple hours maybe, and I don't know why they said, well, we need to hold, we need to wait. Maybe they had other personnel down at Papoose at the time, I don't know, where we couldn't come in and bump noses with them, so to speak.
So would it be safe to say that the highways that you traveled over, for the most part, were paved, at least as far as you could tell?
I'd say about halfway. They were paved. After that, we were on it's not as bad as trying to drive down to Lake Mojave or something down the Power Line Road along the west side of it, but it was bumpy.
Okay.
It was. I could hear that we were on dirt going in, and it stayed dirt until we popped up onto the tarmac, and then they said, okay, you can lift the blinds, and we lifted the blinds at that point and saw whatever we saw, and again, nothing that I saw in the way of weapon systems which were exposed or aviation examples am I wishing to talk about.
Aircraft.
I have no, I'll go as far as to say some of the things that I saw up there had to have been experimental aircraft. But that's all I don't have any authority to say anything else. And God knows if this is broadcast anywhere, everyone is going to end up hearing it. So will our enemies. So, what I saw, know nothing, see nothing.
So how did your work up there progress after that? I mean, were you at some point certified to continue working there and make analysis of tissue samples that were something other than human?
My last few times taken up into the Groom complex to the same location, I was brought into the back room, and in the back room they had an auto slide, what looked like I'm losing the word here, conveyor. And the slides were actually, they looked like rectangular solids. They were set up in a pressurized French type, like a Poissier type French cell. And they were brought in under an otoscope and actually rotated in on somebody else's command.
So these were not translucent slides where they had sliced through something and you were viewing light coming through tissue. You were looking at the hard surface of an opaque specimen from above? Or?
This was the particular microscope that I was working on was an invert scope. The head of the microscope, where the objectives were actually underneath the slide. So I was looking through a very fine barrier between the objective and the item on the inside of the pressurized slide.
Okay.
So it was actually an invert scope, like you would use for tissue or culture.
Okay. Now, did they use that optically clear oil so that the optics could get right up against the specimen, like you see occasionally in microscopy?
There was no oil applied on the invert scope, and in fact, we didn't get up over probably 600 diameters. Looking at these, and they looked like small microglial tissue, but they were not normal. They did not appear normal. They had a external and an internal division for the cytoplasmic process, which looked abnormal, and given the fact that it was dendritic in appearance and it was a tissue culture, I started wondering, and seriously, I had convinced myself at that moment I was looking at something for biowarfare. Because again, I wasn't thinking anything about anything being extraterrestrial.
Okay.
Everything was going to be prosaic to me, and that's the way I think first anyway.
Okay, well, now let me stop you. Now, when you said that the tissue looked dendritic in nature, what does that, to the common person, what does that mean?
Well, it looked like a spider.
A spider.
It looked like a spider. It had a central soma, central nerve cell-type body, and there were spider-like processes or filamentous-type processes which extended out from the periphery of the soma.
Is this process you're describing, is this something that was true for tissues you would find on this planet?
Yes, sir.
Or is this something that you determined as a characteristic of whatever these tissues were from?
Yes, it's a characteristic function of all normal tissue culture cells, where they will behave differently depending upon what they will absorb upon. However, these cells would preferentially attach to the microbeads, but they would not, even if they were juxtaposed to one another, they would not attach to each other. So once they were separated in culture, ostensibly from their point of origin, from in vivo, and brought into an in vitro environment, they would no longer attach to one another. And that was one of the first characteristics, in fact, that was being brought out as I was looking at these. And they said, well, what are you looking for? I said, well, I'm looking for, if these are nerve cells, I'm looking for some sort of processes which would lead to a synapse, or processes which would lead to some sort of intercellular communication if they were brought from a tissue, if they were not just individually brought from separate sources.
Right.
I would be looking for some sort of desmosomal attachments or some sort of relationship between the cells. And it was if they were dancing with separate partners and they were refusing to acknowledge one another.
Okay. You thought this was somewhat unique then?
I did. What I thought immediately is that I was looking at either a chimeric cell produced through serial cloning and transfection.
Now, when you say chimeric, you're talking about perhaps the bonding of two unrelated species, that kind of thing?
Yes, or I was looking at a composite cell of some variety which was produced by infecting a cell of origin, we'll just say cell number 1, with a virus and allowing, for instance, like infecting it with a retrovirus with reverse transcriptase and all of that.
Okay.
And then that was the expression of the virus within the cell during a pre-lytic phase. And that's what I thought when we were looking at it, and that's where my mind was going, because it was trying to divert back. I was trying to regress to the mean, so to speak, and divert back to the prosaic. However, when enough of these tissues were brought out over time, it wasn't making sense to me anymore that it was an act of biological engineering or some sort of a biowarfare experiment, because the cells were functioning normally in and of themselves. And yes, they were wanting to dance with separate partners and all of that, but
at some point you begin to realize that there was something odd here.
Well, yeah, and the thing is that the cells I was looking at, they were oddly sized. They appeared to be mammalian overall, the overall morphology, because I was then being told, okay, we're looking at skin cells, we're looking at brain cells, we're looking at parenchyma from a liver, but it wasn't normal. And I finally got to the point scratching my head saying, wait a minute here. This is not even veterinary histopathology or histology that I'm looking at here, or cytology preps. There's something very odd here that I'm looking at, and I began questioning. Landed on one of the trips and deplaned. And I expected to see the buggy sitting there, but there was a white bus. This is a gray-white bus sitting there off to the left. He said, over there. I said, well, aren't we? No, over there. That's when I was taken down to Papoose for the first time.
Okay.
It was actually in the bus, and later on, years later, they were actually choppering us from there over to the location.
Okay.
We were being choppered, but got into this bus, and I was wondering, what the hell we were doing, because it took off in a different direction, and then they told us shades down, and so we actually helped in closing the shades in the bus. I could tell this was much more gravelly, and it almost felt like a couple times as the guy was driving, he was driving too fast because I could feel the bus sliding. They are wild, some of them. They don't follow rules and they play games. Well, this was my first introduction to it. So we slid along and got down there, and the security said, wait, wait, wait. The security wearing the cami never got off the bus. And they said, okay guys, up and out, up and out. So came, looked around, and I noticed as soon as I got out onto the ground, there were two blue lines. Outside of the blue lines, and they looked like somebody just did a spray painting. Okay. Later on, they actually had the lines in place, but this was it was poor. I mean, it looked bad. And then there were two red lines that were sprayed on the outside of it. He says, gentlemen, this is the security officer on the inside of the van. He says, you stay inside the blue lines. If you wander out of the red lines, he says, you see the red lines, both of you. He said, I want you to both acknowledge this. I said, yes, sir, I do. He says, if you wander outside those red lines, they will shoot you. Now I'm scared. I was extremely frightened at the moment. Shoot me. And he said, they will shoot you. Now I saw for the first time the security at Papoose. They were standing there with the small automatic weapons, staring at me and at him, but it felt like they were staring at me. It scared the hell out of me when I stepped off the bus.
I can imagine.
They were the way it wasn't just their presence; it was the way they were standing there. You can project presence, and of course, I learned to do that as a police officer and all of that. But they were standing there with their weapons on you. I could tell that they were pointing their firearms at me. Mm-hmm. So we got off, and no bravado at this moment, and we followed our way up around to the right. It actually looped a little bit and around to the right to a door where one of the officers was standing at the door. He opened up this, there was no marking on this particular door whatsoever.
Just an inconspicuous door like you'd see in a theater or something?
It was actually inside of the mountain, but there was a roll around the door that I could tell was molding, but it was camouflage molding. Mm-hmm. And it was stuccoed, like spray painted, mm-hmm. so that it looked like sand. And it overhung over the door just enough where the door appeared like it was inset. Mm-hmm. So the door was opened up, we went inside. There's a table there with a security officer. We were asked to identify ourselves. We did. We signed our names. Okay. We were asked to put our social security numbers and date of birth on there as well. Photographs were taken of us at the time. Actual Polaroids were taken of us. So I probably looked like a scared rat there, but from there we were escorted in past what was called a hand scanner. We actually placed our hand on a scanner. I didn't see anything rolling over it, no light, no nothing like that. It was just a flat black screen. Mm-hmm. And they said, okay, fine. A door was then opened from the left to the right, and this is a sliding door from the left to the right, and we went through what appeared almost like an archway. And we were escorted around to the right immediately and down to a nurse's office. Well, we are getting into it here. Down to a nurse's office. There was a male nurse present. He asked us to strip down, which we did. When we stripped down, security toting firearms took our clothing away from us. Now that is a real queer feeling.
So you're buck naked at this point? Or are you
Yes, sir.
You're down to your skivvies?
No, he had us buck naked. Every time into the facility, you are stripped down to your birthday suit I was. There was never a time that I walked in with my clothing that I ever got by 2 guards with firearms in back of me, the male nurse in front of me, and went anywhere past that with my own clothing.
Now here's my next question. Did they weigh you coming and going?
I was getting there.
Okay.
We get weighed 3 or 4 times in this facility. There are weighing pans at the workstations down on level 4 where you have your private workstation. You are standing on a weighing sensor.
And this is to determine whether you're taking or pocketing anything that comes out of the facility.
Including anally.
Exactly right. Just like they would do in a federal penitentiary.
Yeah, there is no way to get anything out of there. Not a way on God's green creation. They've got cameras. When you walk in, there are ball cameras. Not that different from casinos.
Exactly.
It's watching every move you make. There are ball cameras in the restrooms. You can't do anything without being watched in this facility. Nothing. You're not in there not to be watched. You're in there to get a job done. And that's the way the drive was in there. It was, you're here to do the best job that's possible for any human being, get it done. That's just the way we were treated. And that was initially until things calmed down when J1 came in a couple times and arms went around and I got treated like the favorite son, but still.
Now J1, what does that mean?
He is the official honorary first position leader of the MJ-12.
Okay, and they call him J1?
Yeah, it's the number 1 position.
Now is this J1 person someone that the average public individual would recognize?
No. This particular gentleman was on the television a couple times, only a couple times to my knowledge, and it was during the first Gulf War.
J1 is Vice Admiral J.M. McConnell, Director of the National Security Agency, 1992 to 1996. Admiral McConnell has been like Dan's godfather throughout his entire career. Over 40 microbiologists have died strange deaths over the last 5 years. The fact that Dan is still alive is a testament to McConnell's power to control Dan's life. Stargate Productions has been ordered by Admiral McConnell to complete this video biography as soon as possible. That task has been completed, as you are witnessing.
From NBC News in Washington, this is Meet the Press with Tim Rutter.
Our issues this Sunday: what is the real terrorist threat to the United States homeland? How good is our intelligence gathering? And nearly 6 years after September 11th, why is Osama bin Laden still at large? With us, the Director of National Intelligence, Admiral Mike McConnell, in his first television interview. This document, the National Intelligence Estimate, entitled The Terrorist Threat to the U.S. Homeland, was released. How serious is this threat, and what can we do about it? Joining us for an exclusive interview is the Director of National Intelligence, Admiral Mike McConnell. Welcome.
Thank you.
Let me show you a key judgment from this report. Quote, we judge the U.S. homeland will face a persistent and evolving terrorist threat over the next 3 years. In layman's language, for the American viewers watching today, what is the most serious threat facing our country?
Tim, the most serious threat is that the plotters that are being observed will be successful in penetrating our defenses and conducting an attack that would result in mass casualties. Their intent is to effect an attack with mass casualties, a secondary attack.
Dr. Dan Burrish's mentor during his whole life has been Admiral J. Mike McConnell. During McConnell's interview with Russert in 2007, Dan was being debriefed by Stargate Productions. Admiral McConnell, as head of national security for President Bush, as well as being in charge of the Majestic 12 organization, has the power to protect his, in effect, godson, Dr. Burish. Admiral McConnell is the moral compass of the Majestic 12 organization. He appointed Dr. Burish the esteemed position as representative number 9 in that august group in the spring of 2005. Dr. Burish recommended that the group take a vote for or against disclosure in the light of the treaties that had been signed by the off-worlders. As of April 2005, the vote was 6-5 for disclosure. There is always one abstention from voting because of the organization's adherence to Scottish Rite protocols. In September 2005, a second vote was taken. The vote was 8-3 for disclosure. When these votes are taken, they are never reversed. Dan was uncomfortable with MJ-12 organization's protocols. Therefore, Admiral McConnell allowed him to resign and appoint his successor. If UFO researchers and the lay public will politely inquire of Admiral McConnell as to the truthfulness of these statements, Stargate Productions is confident Admiral McConnell will answer in the affirmative.
We're watching them train and
All right. I am fortunate enough to work with our next speaker at Open Minds Magazine. Michael Schratt is an aerospace historian and a draftsman. And so you have seen him on lots of television shows because he's an expert in black projects. He also has recently interviewed Dan Burish at length because Michael will make 3D renderings of various black project planes and also UFOs and things like that. And so what he did was talk to Dan so that we could render in 3D some of what he alleged to have seen at an area, secret underground base near Area 51 called S4. So these graphics are great. And Michael's going to give you in detail everything that Dan Burish told him. So please help me welcome Michael Schratt.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. Okay. Good morning, everyone. First of all, I want to thank Open Minds for giving me the opportunity to join all of you today. And what I'd like to do for you this morning is give you a brief overview of Project Aquarius and give you some specific details regarding the interaction that Dr. Dan Burish had with an extraterrestrial called J-Rod. I'll give you a background of Dr. Dan Burish. We'll be discussing level 4-1. We'll be talking about walking the line. We'll describe what that actually means, what it pertains to. I'm going to give you a virtual blueprint floor-by-floor walkthrough of the 9 hangar bays and all the way through the facility. We'll consider the extraterrestrial and alien craft because there is a difference. We'll talk about the Roswell craft. We'll talk about the propulsion research laboratory at S4. We'll consider the catwalk, the files department, and the cafeteria. For level 4-2, we'll consider Project Sidekick, the weapons research and development, Alice in Wonderland Rabbit, this is a good historical note, Looking Glass Device, Stargate's ERBs or Einstein-Rosen bridges, the doctrine of convergent timeline paradox. Dropping down to level 4-3, we'll consider the MJ-12 residential suites, the boardroom, the culture department, and analysis department. 4-4, we'll look at the weighing pads, the biocontainment lab's badge board and decontamination procedure. And finally, on level 4-5, which is the lower floor of the facility, We'll consider the clean sphere, the scissor lift, the lighting, the iris aperture, the kick plates, airlock, and the test, which is the totally encapsulated suit. So that's the layout of what we'll be talking about today. So who is Dr. Dan Bursch? He was the youngest person ever to be elected into the Los Angeles Microscopical Society. And in 1985, he received his bachelor degree in biological sciences, and in 1986, a bachelor degree in psychology. In 1987, Dan explored the feasibility of becoming a priest here at St. Patrick's School of Theology. However, that didn't quite work out, so we actually had to bypass that. Now, in 1989, it was Dr. Edward Teller who arranged for Dan to take classes at the University of New York, Stony Brook, and he earned his PhD there. So I ask this question to all of you. Where have we seen this gentleman before, Dr. Edward Teller? Where have we seen him come up in the stories of these type craft and vehicles before? It was none other than Dr. Teller who arranged for, allegedly, Bob Lazar to get his interview at EG&G at McCarran International Airport, and that's how he got his job at S4. So we have secondary independent confirmation that Dr. Edward Teller was involved. In 1991, he was employed at Desert Storm as a biowarfare expert. Now, in 1994, he received his Q clearance at S4, and he began working on something called Project Aquarius, and I will draw your attention here to the aircraft sectional chart that anyone can get at any local airport. This is something that's readily available. And if you look up here on the right-hand corner, you've got R-4808N. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the most highly guarded airspace, Dreamland airspace in America. This is the borderline here. You'll notice Groom Lake is right up here, so we can see it does exist. Approximately 12 miles south of Groom Lake, there's something called Papoose Lake or Area S4. And it's important to note that if you ever try to break into this airspace within the 4808N airspace, Dreamland, three things immediately happen. Number one, ATC at Dreamland, Air Traffic Control, will not allow you clearance to enter into their airspace. Number two, they will immediately, if you do not egress the area, they will immediately scramble an F-16 who will perform a particular maneuver where they'll fly perpendicular to your flight path at about 100 feet away from your aircraft, and then when you fly into his jet wash, it will either depart from controlled flight, or you might end up wrecking one of your wings or tearing one of your wings off. So that's the second thing. And the third and final thing is you'll receive a final warning to exit the area, and if nothing happens, they will lock on with a Sidewinder missile and they will neutralize the target. So the bottom line is don't try to break into Dreamland airspace. Okay, so at S4, again, he received his clearance, and he worked under the direction of the Naval Research Laboratory and the Defense Intelligence Agency. So these are the two outfits that are running the program at Area S4. The EG&G terminal, 737-200, how do you get to Area S4? Well, it's the EG&G terminal, which is the gateway to Area 51 and S4. As you're flying on this airliner here, just before the hairpin turn into the landing approach on Groom Lake runway, which is a 27,000-foot runway, it's the largest runway in the world, there's an ATC clearance called Pyramid. That is the clearance to land at Groom Lake. And what's interesting, a historical point from Dan Bursch indicated that on the trip on the 737-200 to Groom Lake, they played Neil Diamond's song Coming to America over and over and over again. So the question is, what is the encrypted symbolic message that they're playing on the airplane as you're going there? Well, under its original interpretation, that song talks about immigrants coming to America to make a better life for themselves. That makes a lot of sense. But under the direction of what happens at S4, it actually is talking about extraterrestrials coming to America, and specifically coming to S4. That was confirmed by Dan Bursch as the correct interpretation. Now, when you land at Groom Lake, How do you get to S4? It's 12 miles away. There's 3 ways. You can take a blue-colored Air Force bus. That's number 1. Number 2, you take a U.S. Army Black Hawk helicopter. The third and final option is a Russian Mi-24 Hind-D helicopter gunship. So those are the 3 options that you take to get to S4. Now we're flying, we've just landed, we're at the helicopter landing pad. We're now going to enter the facility for a virtual walkthrough. And you'll notice that there are some very interesting lines here on the tarmac. We have 2 parallel red lines, okay? And then there are 2 parallel blue lines. This is called walking the line. And you are told, according to Dan Burrish, and this is a very oppressive society, it's not a user-friendly area. It's not something that is a nice place to be at, because there's black guards with guns, and it's an oppressive society. You are told to follow the blue lines and do not breach the boundaries of the red lines, because if you do, ladies and gentlemen, they will shoot you. That's the level of security that we're talking about here. Now, we're entering the facility, and you'll see this swinging door to enter the facility. It turns out that that is actually incorrect, so we've made the correction. The actual door to get into the S4 facility is none other than a double sliding glass door with an indented receptacle, which is circular. You turn that to the right, that's how you get into the facility. Very similar to what you would see on your patio door. Now we've got the layout. We start at the top, it's 4-1. Second floor is 4-2. We've got 4-3, 4-4, and 4-5. We flip to the AutoCAD rendering to give you an idea of what that facility looks like. Keep in mind that anything below 4-1 is all underground. Now, area S4, 4-1. This is the blueprint that I was able to put together under the direction of Dr. Dan Burrish. And if the first thing that happens when you walk in this facility, you enter that door, what you see is this long hallway here, very long hallway. It has the same type line configuration or stripes on the floor. To the left, you'll see a red line. You cannot go to the left. On the right, there's a blue line. You can get access to that. So we're walking up here. The first room to the left, ladies and gentlemen, is actually the avionics lab. Just beyond that is the propulsion systems lab. Over here we have a files department, and we have something called the briefing room. This is a very important room, the briefing room. Why? Because there's something called King Tut's, or training update tapes, and they have something called blue 3-ring DTIC binders, which is Defense Technical and Information Center binders. So I just submit, we've all heard this thing about Carl Sagan stating that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Well, here's where the evidence is. In this facility, they not only have the hardware, but they've got the tissue samples, they've got the motion picture film reels, they've got the high visual digital audio tapes. It's all here. This is what we're looking for. So, on the far western wall, on the interior of each of the 9 hangar bays, there is a 4-1 in red paint circled by a red circle. So that indicates that you are at area S4, floor 1. That's the significance there. The first hangar bay, which is right here, this is hangar bay number 1, was none other than Bob Lazar's sport model, or a P-45 sport model. Hangar bay number 2, we believe to be the exact same vehicle, or possibly an ARV, alien reproduction vehicle. Hangar bay 3, ladies and gentlemen, was the Roswell craft, which was covered by a tarp, so Dan didn't get to see the entire configuration, but it was the Roswell craft. Next we have, in the next hangar, which is number 4, is the P-52 Orion craft. The next hangar bay 5 was empty. Hangar bay 6 contained a man-made F-22 conversion, or sort of a dog and pony show of what was in hangar bay 3. So it was a man-made version of the Roswell craft. Up here we have, it's believed to be the 1953 crash retrieval in Kingman, Arizona. That was what was in the next hangar, which is 7. Hangar bay 8 contained a black isosceles triangle that was nicknamed the licorice drop. Hangar Bay 9, ladies and gentlemen, was empty. So that's the layout here. Up on the left-hand corner, I've got a very crude gymnasium lighting. That's the important thing to remember. When you're in this facility, it's not impeccable lighting on the first floor, so that's why we have that. Moving over to the right, we have the biohazard suppression area. We have the overflow files department, and then we have the communication area, and then you'll look over to the bottom right here is the meals ready to eat, or the cafeteria, and you'll notice here that the different colors indicate the compartmentalization of the people who work on different programs at Area S4. So if you work on Project Sidekick, or if you work on Project Galileo, you sit in the red area. If you work on weapons research, you sit in the black area. As we mentioned, orange area is Project Looking Glass. So what they're doing is they're quarantining the employees and engineers who work on the different programs so that these things remain secret. Okay, so this is a far look down of the main hallway. As soon as you walk in, you see that red stripe and the blue stripe on the right-hand side. We've got the avionics lab and the propulsion system labs on the immediate left-hand side. Now, right to the left, there is an I Want to Believe poster, confirmed by Dr. Dan Burish. Over to the right, there is a nurse there and a weighing pad. So all this talk about trying to smuggle things out of S4 so that we can prove all this is real, well, it's next to impossible. Why? Because they weigh you in the nude when you get there, and they weigh you in the nude when you get out. And if there's a discrepancy within ounces, it's over. So you've got to be very careful here. Now, 4-1, looking down through the catwalk to the left-hand side. This is the first hangar bay, is the 52-foot diameter Bob Lazar sport model. So we're looking down through the catwalk. Over here we have Hangar Bay 2, which again is believed to be the same craft or an alien reproduction vehicle. Hangar Bay 3 is the P-24 Roswell craft. You'll notice the 4-1, we're at Area S4, Level 1. Now, this is interesting. I did not make this statement, but Dr. Dan Burish and even the late geologist Dr. Phil Schneider indicated that the F-22 Raptor, the exterior configuration of the F-22 Raptor was originating from the original Roswell craft. That's a very bombshell statement to make, but if you take away the vertical stabilizers on the F-22 Raptor and then you remove the air intakes and then you do something what Dan Burish told me, is if you drew a spline curve and connected all of the major points or intersecting areas on the Raptor, what you'd end up with, ladies and gentlemen, is the Roswell craft. So this comes directly from Dan Burish. Is there any way to prove this? Well, take a look at the historical legacy on the origin point of stealth technology, and we'll start up here. There is a defining feature that goes through all these configurations. You've got the FB-22 up here. We've got a Russian stealth configuration here. Down here to the left, we've got a Northrop configuration. Just to the right of that, we've got the Testers Model Corporation, Rockford, Illinois, the F-19 configuration by Lockheed, and then we've got the configuration from the movie Stealth, which was released in 2005. All these configurations contain the same design model. In fact, they contain the same wing root to fuselage joint, which is completely integrated and smooth contoured, identical to the B-2 stealth bomber, to reduce the radar cross signature. That is the defining design feature on these stealth technologies, the same thing you'll see in the Roswell craft. Hangar Bay 4 was a P-52 Orion craft. This is the original configuration. This is the cleaned up configuration on the bottom side by Dr. Dan Burish. Hangar Bays 5 and Bays 9 were empty. And you'll notice too that there are these interesting tracks here, and these were used to pull the craft out of the hangar bays so that they could be test flown on the tarmac immediately from the entrance of the facility. Hangar Bay 6 was the man-made reproduction of the P-24 Roswell craft. That was in Hangar Bay 6. Hangar Bay 7, again, that Dan believed, but could be completely confirmed, that this was the 1953 Kingman UFO crash retrieval vehicle was covered by a tarp. Hangar Bay 8 contained a black isosceles triangle. They called it the licorice drop, according to Dan Burrish. And I will mention that everything from Hangar Bay 1 to Hangar Bay 7 were all extraterrestrial vehicles. Hangar Bay 8 was the only alien vehicle, because there's a difference between extraterrestrials and aliens. And according to Dr. Dan Burrish, the exterior configuration, or what it looked like when you saw this craft, it looked like a black liquid mercury that you could fall into. It was a very unique surface texture on this particular craft. So, we've got Bob Lazar stating that S4 exists. That's what he said back in 1988, 1989.
Bob Lazar is a nuclear physicist specializing in advanced propulsion systems. In 1989, he was hired by the military to back-engineer the propulsion system of an extraterrestrial craft. Lazar worked at what is undoubtedly the most top-secret research facility in the world, S4.
There was absolutely no ET craft, ET technology, anything like that at Area 51. This is why S4 was made specifically to separate it there. People at Area 51 do not have the clearance.
We've got Dr. Dan Burrish coming forward stating that S4 exists. We also have Bill Uhouse, who worked on the flight simulators at S4 and at Los Alamos National Lab. So we've got 3 independent people confirming the same thing. You'll see the cutaway AutoCAD drawing originating from Bill Uhouse, indicating that there was a flight simulator, a flying saucer flight simulator that was attached to a gimbal mount, and you could rotate this thing almost up to 90 degrees. There was a diagnostic cable attached to the vehicle when it was static, but when it was energized, the diagnostic cable gets released, and then you could quote-unquote fly the vehicle at that time.
The following interview with Will Uhouse took place on December 20th, 2005.
And my mom and I both put him on the airplane to go there in Orlando, and he came back. When he came back, we could see he was visibly shaking all the time. He just was not himself. And we got him back to the house, and we were making dinner and stuff, and the guy just kind of, this is my father, he falls apart. You know, just starts shaking. He says, I've got to say this, I've got to say this. And he says, they are real. I have now been invited to join the project. He says, we have a disc, and it's not from this world.
Captain Bill Uhouse served 10 years in the Marine Corps as a fighter pilot and 4 years with the Air Force at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base as a civilian doing flight testing of exotic experimental aircraft. Later, for the next 30 years, he worked for the defense contractors at Area 51 as an engineer of anti-gravity propulsion systems on flight simulators for exotic aircraft and on actual flying discs. Will Uhouse hasn't seen his father in over 5 years. He is anxious to view this interview of his father that took place spring of 2000.
I was at Wright-Patterson, of course. I was approached by an individual that, and I'm not going to mention his name, to determine if I wanted to work in an area on just new creative things, okay? And Apparently that was the flying disc simulator. What they had done, they had selected several of us, and they reassigned me to Link Aviation, which was a simulator manufacturer. At that time, they were building what they call the C-11B and F-102 simulator, B-47 simulator, and so forth. And they wanted us to get the experience before we actually started work on the flying disc simulator, which I spent 30-some years working on.
So they had flying disc simulators, to your knowledge, when was the operation?
I don't think any went into operation until the late or early 60s, around 62 or 63. As I watched, the reason why I'm saying this is because the simulator wasn't actually functional until around 1958, where the simulator was actually operable. You know, for the simulator that they used, or the craft that they used to build, which is a 30-meter one, was the one that crashed in Arizona, Kingman, Arizona, back in 53 or 52. I think it was 53. That's the one they used. That's the first one that they took out to the test site. Not a controlled, you know, where they knocked it out of the sky or anything. It was a controlled craft, you know, that the aliens wanted to present to our government, or the USA. It landed about 15 miles from, which used to be an Army air base, which is now a defunct Army base. I forget, I can't recall the name of it. But that particular craft, there were some problems with, number one, getting it on the flatbed to take it up to Area 51. They couldn't get it across the dam because of the road. It had to be barged across the Colorado River at the time.
So, the P-45 craft was the sport model, measured 52 feet in diameter. It was 16 feet high. It had a smooth, polished aluminum exterior configuration. And then I want to take you inside here, show you some of the interior components. It had 3 different levels. We've got the lower bay, we've got the mid-deck, and the upper deck. So that's what we've got right there. Now let's zoom inside. We'll take a look at what it looks like inside. On the bottom section of the vehicle, there were 3 gravity amplifiers. Right above that, we have the mid-deck, which contained 3 gravity amplifier heads, 3 seats that all sat in the same direction, which were too small for human test pilots to fit into. Then we've got a gravity amplifier system here. We've got a antimatter reactor and a waveguide that goes all the way up through the mid-deck and what we believe to be the avionics or navigation department right here, and these are not windows. So that's the layout of the sport model according to Mr. Bob Lazar. Now, spend 15 seconds on the propulsion system of this vehicle. Element 115 is machined into triangles at Los Alamos, transported to S4. It is loaded into the antimatter reactor, and then the target substance is bombarded with protons. And when a proton plugs into the nucleus of an atom of element 115, it bumps its atomic number up to element 116, which immediately decays and releases antimatter. That is the power source for the vehicle in a near 100% thermoelectric generator. So that's a breakdown of the propulsion system. Project Aquarius terminology. Let's talk about some terminology here. Project Galileo. Project Aquarius is nothing more than an umbrella term for everything having to do with mankind's interaction with extraterrestrials. Below that, there are about 5 different programs. The first one is Project Galileo. It dealt with the propulsion system of extraterrestrial and future terrestrial vehicles. So that was the first one. Second one under Project Aquarius was Project Sidekick. Relates to a weapons program. No further information is available from Dan Burish on that program. Project Looking Glass dealt with the physics of seeing the effects of an artificially produced gravity wave on time. The fourth project was a second-generation weapons program which originated with Project Sidekick, no program name provided. The fifth program dealt with a series of biological defense operations which Dan served in the capacity of senior scientist. So those are the programs that fell under Project Aquarius. So how did the J-Rod craft, or what was termed the Kingman 1953 UFO crash retrieval, how did it get to S4? Ladies and gentlemen, it got there by a 40-ton, what's called a dragon wagon tank hauler. That's how they got it there to the facility. Now, in 1953, according to Dr. Dan Bursch, there was a UFO crash retrieval at Kingman, Arizona. There were 3 bodies recovered. 1 died on impact. He was still contained to his biocontainment device. The other one went to Los Alamos, and the third and final one went to Area 51 S4. That's the J-Rod that Dan Bursch worked with. Now, in 1954, according to Dan Bursch, there was a meeting between President Dwight D. Eisenhower and representatives of the P-52 Orions, and a treaty was signed. A copy of that treaty was kept at Area S4, Level 4-1, and they also gave President Eisenhower something called the Orion Cube, which we'll talk about as well. What is the Orion Cube? It was also known as the Yellow Book. It has nothing to do with phone numbers, okay? What it is it's a 8 by 8 inch square cube, and it's a quantum viewing device that you could, once it's accessed, you could look at the probabilities of future events. There was protocols that had to be followed in order to activate this. And at one time, it's believed that this cube was stored at level 4-1. Later, it was moved to the Scottish Rite Masonic Temple just outside Washington, D.C. From that point further, we don't know where it is. So that's the lineage of the Orion Cube.
Unsealed alien files. Are human beings alone on planet Earth? Or is it possible aliens are living among us?
If anyone on this planet knew of extraterrestrials interacting with us, it would have to be our world leaders. And they're not telling us.
Some believe mankind's greatest encounter may have ended in a pact bartering human lives with an extraterrestrial race. A pact allegedly executed by none other than the President of the United States. Unsealed case file, the Presidential Alien Pact. Palm Springs, California. In 1954, U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower lands for a winter holiday. During the trip, he mysteriously disappears on the night of February 20th, igniting a firestorm of media speculation. But witnesses who came forward in later decades claim that during this time, Eisenhower visited Edwards Air Force Base, where he met with an alien race.
Purported witnesses to this event claim that Eisenhower was actually asked there by the extraterrestrials in order to make some sort of deal.
The aliens said to be at this meeting were a race known to ufologists as the Pleiadians, frequently described as taller and larger than regular humans. They are known for their shockingly blonde hair and clear eyes, earning them the nickname Nordics.
And this meeting was very much tied in with an effort by these extraterrestrials to persuade the US government not to go ahead with the development of thermonuclear weapons.
But just 10 days after the alleged meeting took place, the U.S.'s Bravo hydrogen bomb was detonated in Bikini Atoll. It appeared no treaty to end atomic weapons was reached.
So another path was chosen, meeting with other groups of extraterrestrials who were not as opposed to the United States developing nuclear weapons.
The second meeting between Eisenhower and extraterrestrials took place at the Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico, where he met with the Greys, and this time, a treaty would be reached.
Their alleged deal, they would provide advanced technology far beyond human capabilities. But in exchange, the Greys would be given the freedom to abduct humans for DNA and experimentation.
Now, interesting to note that there are 3 events that took place in 1947. Is there a coincidence? I don't think there is. We've got the Roswell crash on July 2nd, 1947. Then we've got the formation of the CIA in 1947 and the formation of the Independent Air Force also in 1947. 3 events happening at the same time. In 1952, it was the National Security Agency who, according to the CIA, had improper intelligence, so partial majestic control of Project Aquarius was handed over to the, quote, new boys on the block because they came after the Central Intelligence Agency. So there was this animosity that continues today between the Central Intelligence Agency and the National Security Agency. Now, moving down to 4-2, we've got the SolidWorks rendering and also the AutoCAD rendering of 4-2. Moving into the facility, the first thing you'll see when you look and walk into level 4-2 is a 3-foot tall statue of an Alice in Wonderland rabbit. There's a symbolic message that they're giving you here. There's a primary looking glass device, and then on either side of that primary looking glass device, ladies and gentlemen, there are 2 secondary ERBs or Einstein-Rosen bridges. Up on the left, I've got a graphic of what we have termed the galactic positioning codes, because when you access a Stargate at the S4 facility, you don't need to have a galactic positioning code on your arm or flip book, because all that data is inside the control room. But when you go outside S4, you do need to get this positioning code data so that you know where you're going. Here we've got the jump pads at 4-2. And then down here, we've got the Project Sidekick storage facility. There's also one just below that. To the right, we've got weapons research and development. I've got a blown-up view of the looking glass device here. We're going to consider something called the doctrine of convergent timeline paradox. And then we're also going to consider, how did the U.S. government get the technology to access naturally occurring stargates throughout the world? It has to do with the Sumerian cylinder seals that were recovered in Baghdad years ago. Now, this is a SolidWorks rendering of the looking glass device. You'll notice that there's this toroid or donut ring-shaped device. And inside this, we have multiple permanent electromagnets. And this is consistent with 6 electromagnetic fields that form above this device. There is a up and down actuating rotating cylinder, so it's a height adjustable rotating cylinder which is attached to a 3-axis gimbal system. That's the general layout of the looking glass device. Now, what does this thing do? Well, it can actually warp the fabric of space-time both forwards and back, and you can actually see the probabilities of future events. That's the primary function. However, there's a secret to the looking glass device, which Dan Burrish has told us. What you can do is you can flip this device up at 45-degree angle, and if you tune it to a slightly different frequency, it can be used as a Stargate. So it actually has a dual purpose. You've got these spires or guide rings just above the looking glass device. These are used to guide the electromagnetic field over the looking glass device. It's something that you can hit with your hand. Now, per Dan's comments, there was a 3-foot tall statue of an Alice in Wonderland rabbit. He had a maroon vest, he had golden fringes, and he had black buttons. He was holding a clock, and this is symbolic that You're going down the rabbit hole into a world that's beyond belief, and that's exactly what happens in the Looking Glass area. So it was a symbolic encrypted message.
Experts worry the opening of a Stargate could have terrifying consequences for a civilization as relatively primitive as our own.
If Stargates were built by a race of extraterrestrials to enable them to traverse vast distances, what chance do we have of manipulating that technology?
We'd be like infants playing with a nuclear bomb.
The main concern is that no matter who attempts to open the Stargate, the end result could spell disaster for all mankind.
That would be very, very dangerous for a Stargate to be opened prematurely like that without knowing who would be coming through.
An out-of-control wormhole might pull the Earth through a Stargate, piece by painful piece.
What if we created a black hole right here on planet Earth and we snuffed ourselves out of existence without even realizing what we were about to do?
It would be as if we never existed.
Now, when we talk about time travel and we talk about the doctrine of convergent timeline paradox, in my assessment, there is no better illustration of this concept than the movie Back to the Future 2. And they talk about this in that movie. So just to illustrate this, for example, on the bottom here, we've got something called the flow of time, representative of the bottom arrow or timeline 1. That's the timeline we're on. So we're moving down this timeline and everything is fine, everything is great. And then somebody decides to flip on one of these looking glass devices, and this is called the looking glass point of observation. That's right here. Now, we have someone that is looking into the future of probable events. At that point, at that exact point in time, we are no longer, ladies and gentlemen, on timeline 1, but we are now on timeline 2, and we have theoretically we have affected our future timeline 1. So that's how this works. Now, in this movie, a DeLorean is used to go from the year 1985 to the year 2015, and a character by the name of Biff Tannen, he eventually comes into possession of something called the Gray's Sports Almanac, 1950 to 2005. He picks this up from an 80s memorabilia store. He goes back to the year 1985, and it's a cakewalk. He knows all the results, all the sports scores, to the horse racing, to NFL, to hockey. He turns out to be a billionaire. It's just incredible. But in the process of doing that, he completely destroys himself, everyone he's with, and everything, all the surroundings. So you can see of the catastrophic consequences of looking into the future, it has a very serious consequence. And that's borne out by what we see here with the Mayan calendar. Some believe, ladies and gentlemen, that on December 21st of 2012, it's the end of the world. However, some take a more positive approach and indicate that this is a new dawning of an age of enlightenment. And this is, if we flip over to the prophecy rock by the Hopis here, they have a similar motif. They talk about the evolution of mankind's consciousness on this bottom straight line, and then something happens. An event takes place where we go off into chaos, and that's what you see with this squiggly line. So again, it's very destructive in some cases to try to predict future events. It can have catastrophic consequences. Here you see the rendering, 3D Max Studio rendering of the looking glass device. We've got the transport pads in this location. Everything that took place in this facility was recorded on digital videotape. So they have the evidence, there's no question about it. You can see the electromagnetic fields forming above the looking glass device. There was a stand clear yellow and black stripe that followed the circumference of the looking glass device. Now again, this is Dan Burrish's rendering. We talked about the looking glass configuration. It's the general configuration on the upper left-hand corner. And then on the upper right-hand corner, we've rotated the device 45 degrees from the horizontal, and now it's in the, quote, Stargate configuration. So that's what we see there. The flip book, this was something that engineers wore on their arms, and it was kind of a GPS code book. because you have to know where you are and where you're going when you operate or access one of these stargates. Now, some of you may have seen the movie Stargate. The actual Stargate looks nothing like what you see in the movies. The only thing that is consistent is this metal catwalk that gets you into the actual Stargate. That's the only similarity in the entire operation. Level S4, level 3. We're moving on to level 3. This is the SolidWorks rendering. Below, we have the AutoCAD rendering. Now, there are at least 3 primary areas to 4-3. You'll notice that there are 3 distinct segments here. Each has 4 residential suites. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the Majestic 12 residential suites. That's where they stay when they get to S4. It consists of a very simple 1-bedroom apartment with a sunken living area. There's a tile walkway to enter the facility. There's a single TV. There's 1 single bathroom. So that's the S4 Majestic 12 residential suite. You also know that we've got the culture department, we've got the analysis department just to the right and below the culture department. Up here on the right, we've got the call-outs, the leader call-outs. We've got slider trays, we've got pressure incubators. And when I was going through this, it really dawned on me that there's a lot of attention to detail here, and it was my assessment that this was coming from a man who had practical application experience in working in this environment. I mean, it just seemed to me that you couldn't make this up. There was a lot of detail here. It really seemed that this was someone who could speak from experience that was actually working in the facility. Now, level 4-4, that's where we're moving on to now. A number of primary areas here. We have the badge board. This is a blow-up of the badge board on 4-4. We've got a meeting room or a board room in that facility. There are multiple biocontainment labs in level 4-4, and we'll zoom in and blow up that area right here. These are the decontamination areas, and Dan Burrish's desk at S4, level 4-4, was right in this facility right here. So again, the level of attention to detail to me was just astounding. Really seemed like someone who was actually working there. Now, some of you may have seen this before. This is Dan Burrish's security badge at S4. We've got MADGE here, that's short for Majestic. That was the program that was operated under Truman in 1947. And then we've got these diagonally striped blue and darker blue running along the upper left-hand corner. This is the same configuration that Bob Lazar talked about as well. So again, we've got secondary independent confirmation that there was a security badge that actually looked like that. His badge number was H6196MAJ. Level 4-5, very important floor. This is the clean sphere floor. And you'll notice that there is an iris. This iris can move out for the clean sphere floor. You've got these orange cables going across the clean sphere, and they are to suspend the, quote, beehive lights. There was a boardroom on the right side, 1 boardroom on the left side, and then we've got the actuation of the actual clean sphere floor. So what does this thing actually look like? Before you get into the clean sphere, there's multiple protocols that have to be followed. This is the entire layout of the protocols. The 4-5 gantry vehicle and overview of clean sphere entry protocol. So you've got the totally encapsulated suit that you have to contend with. You have to have a positive pressure environment in that suit. And the umbilical cords that take place at this stage are integrated into the clean sphere. Now, detail views. We've got the PINS device. What did Dan Burrish do when he got there? He worked with this PINS device, which is the pressure-induced needle system. He carried a briefcase with him when he got into the airlock, which gained access to the clean sphere. Down here I've got the representation of the 40-ton Dragon Wagon tank hauler. Shows you how they got the craft to the facility. And this is a rendering of the airlock here. This is a layout of what the 4-5 facility looks like. So picture in your mind's eye a large square building, somewhat similar to what we have here. And on all 4 corners, you'll have this fillet radius. So the corners aren't sharp, but they're blended really nicely. And then on the lower floor, you've got something called a scissor lift. It's the same type of scissor lift you see in manufacturing, in construction sites. And just above that, of course, we've got a hydraulically actuated scissor lift. There's a floor with a large circular cutout with something called the clean sphere. And the clean sphere, ladies and gentlemen, is not a complete sphere. It's like an orange cut in half, so it's strictly a half of a sphere. That's what we'll be considering here. Here you see the SolidWorks rendering of the clean sphere device, and then the scissor lift, almost identical to what you would see at your local airport with these concession trucks that bring this box up to the 747 cargo bay and then bring in the meals. That's the same type configuration that you would see at the bottom of 4-5. Here's the rendering of what the clean sphere actually looked like. It was 52 feet across. The plexiglass clear bubble was 2 inches thick. Think about the manufacturing that had to take place to get that there. Just an incredible level of engineering. Impeccable lighting was located on 4-5, which is different than level 4-1. There were 7 indented windows, or Majestic 12 observation gallery windows. They measured 2.5 feet wide, 4.5 feet tall. So there were 7 of those so that you could look down inside the clean sphere as you're taking tissue samples from the J-rod. That's what we see here. Now we've got something called the beehive lights. These beehive lights could actually move along trapeze cables. They could be lowered and raised through a telescopic device, and these were actually designed and built by J-rods and the S4 engineers. Just an impeccable level of lighting on 4-5. Why is that needed? Because you don't want any shadows when you're taking tissue samples from an extraterrestrial. Here you can see the edge of the 4-5 floor, which is in the yellow and black stripe right here, and then also the edge of the clean sphere bubble right here. That's what we're indicating in this illustration. Now, there's something called kick plates that actually are manually operated, and they seal the gap between the clean sphere edge and the floor of 4-5, the opening. That's what they do. And according to Dan Burish, these were done by hand manually, and when you slam these down, there's a big bang that takes place. So it's something that he really stressed. Here we see the scissor lift lifting the clean sphere up to the second floor of 4-5. And then you can see again the hydraulically actuated scissor lift. Now, we're talking about the TESS, or totally enclosed suit, similar to what you would see in the Gemini, Mercury, even the Apollo program of 1969. It's a positive pressure suit to keep out biocontaminants. That's actually its job. And when Dan Burish was at 4-5 inside the clean sphere, he was taking upwards of 300 tissue samples from the J-rod because he suffered from a genetic neuropathy defect, and the overall program was to find a cure for that genetic defect. And one way they did that is to use this pressure-induced needle system that Dr. Dan Burish personally told me was very small. He called it a Saturday night special. And it had a pneumatically actuated hose off the aft end of the pins device. There was a small cartridge that was loaded right inside the shaft here, and you could take the tissue samples that was sent up to the analysis department. So that's how they did that. He also carried a briefing case with him with multiple needles and cartridges that went inside the clean sphere as well. Now again, remember, they weigh you in the nude when you get in, then when you drop down to 4-5, they weigh you in the nude again. So there's just no way you're going to sneak anything out of 4-5. This is a very well done pencil sketch by Mark McCandlish, who is again the world's premier aerospace illustrator, showing Dan Burish being suited up in the test suit and then entering the airlock or decontamination chamber for entry into the clean sphere. Now, what in the world does J-rod mean? I mean, we've heard this before. In its simplest terms, J-rod means 15, because J on the computer keyboard is the 10th letter in the English language. The dash or rod was symbolic of the Mayan glyph that indicated the number 5. So you put those together, you get 15. That's also symbolic because he traveled from 15 light years away to get to Earth. So that's the definition of J-Rod and how he got his name. Now, 2 quotes from Dan Bursch that are very important. He said, "I have never met an alien, but I have met an extraterrestrial. The difference being that an extraterrestrial such as a J-Rod is actually a future human and therefore shares a same human lineage. A true alien, on the other hand, would bear no such human lineage." So that's the difference between an extraterrestrial and an alien. Now, when he was working there, you can see him with the PINS device taking samples from the J-Rod. And he was called Keala, a little bit of description of what he looked like. He measured 3.5 feet tall. He had dark brown appearance, very black inset eyes, a disproportionately large head. He had a small nose, long arms, and no teeth. Interesting to note that the designation for this particular J-Rod was EBE-53AZ2. That stands for Extraterrestrial Biological Entity, 1953 UFO Crash Retrieval, Kingman, Arizona, number 2. Because remember, the first one died on impact, the other one went to a Y11 facility at Los Alamos. Now, during one of these tissue sample sessions, remember, you have to follow a certain protocol to approach this J-Rod. You have to raise up your right hand, the J-Rod raises his right hand, and then you take multiple bride strips together, and then you meet in the center. During one occasion within the clean sphere, the J-Rod, who was known as Keala, he broke the protocol, rushed Dan, and they had developed a friendship at this time. So this had never happened before, and he wasn't under attack, but Dan Bursch was startled about what took place. He stepped back and accidentally caught his boot of the total encapsulated suit on the grid structure of the bottom of floor of 4-5, and he tripped over backwards on his oxygen tank, and the J-Rod proceeded to infuse into him a tremendous amount of material having to do with future events. So it's incredible what took place inside the clean sphere. This is an illustration by Mark McCandless showing the decontamination process within the airlock for entry into the 4-5 facility. Now, again, how did they get this technology to access these naturally occurring stargates? Ladies and gentlemen, they got those from the Sumerian cylinder seals, in some cases from the Baghdad Museum. Now, what you'll do here is you'll take a piece of wet clay and you'll roll that over the clay, the cylinder seal, and you'll end up with this positive relief. Now, according to Dan Bursch, what the government figured out how to do is you take a mirror, go right down the center line of one of these glyphs, and you get a mirror image, which is nothing more than a blueprint on how you access these naturally occurring stargates. That's how they did it. That's how they did it. Now, in 2003, something interesting happened. J-Rod was moved from his position within the Clean Sphere 4-5 facility. He was flown to Abydos Temple, which is down the Nile River. Perhaps some of you have been there, actually. And remember, he has to be in his own positive pressure atmospheric environment or he'll die. So they ended up building a stroller for him. This is Dr. Dan Bursch's illustration of what that stroller actually looked like. And recall, too, that they were friends at the time. So Dan Bursch was sad that J-Rod could not go home to his family and be with his family. He had a compassion for him. So in this act of compassion, during the accessing by the government of one of these naturally occurring stargates at Abydos Temple, Dan Burish thrust forward that stroller and pushed Kayla into this stargate, sending him home. However, Dan and the stroller device were kicked out. He got into a lot of trouble for this, but it was an act of compassion on Dr. Dan Burish. There's a very interesting piece of nostalgia at the end of Groom Lake Runway, according to Dan Burish. There is a sign there that has multiple arrows pointing in every direction, and the sign says home. And this is a symbolic message that what takes place at S4, perhaps Groom Lake, home is underground, it's in outer space, it's north, it's east, it's west, home is everywhere. There's a symbolic encrypted message being employed in this symbol here. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think it's really important that we honor the courage that Dan Burish had to come forward and give us this information regarding the specific details of the S4 facility and providing all of us a potential for a very bright future which is on the nearby horizon, and I want to thank you for your attention.
In this December 18th, 2005 debriefing by Dan's scientific assistant, Marcia McDowell, Dan tells how he took tissue samples from the J-Rod with a pressurized extraction gun. He goes on to explain in great detail how the extraction gun device was constructed. Then he describes the necessary protocols for suiting up to enter the hyperbolic clean sphere. Toward the end of the time he spent with the J-Rod in 1995, the J-Rod approached him unexpectedly, which caused Dan to panic and stumble backwards onto his back, after which the J-Rod climbed up on his chest and looked deeply into Dan's eyes, flooding him with valuable information about Earth's exotic past and possible catastrophic future. In this series, you will learn information never before made public. Astonishing, amazing, earth-shaking, yes, but it's simply the truth. Because this information is so revolutionary, there are many disinformation specialists on the internet attacking Dan's credibility.
Well, when you know that these people are out there and they're making a concerted effort to try to undermine any work that you're trying to accomplish, before it even has a hearing by the general public, before it's ever evaluated on its own merit, then you have to ask yourself, why are they so very afraid to even listen? If they don't know what you're about to say, but if they know what you're going to say is straight down the line, and they are terrified that you're going to let something out, then it becomes a lot clearer why they're going to these lengths to try to derail any work that you're doing.
Well, I really think that trying to size them up, that they care little about whether or not I'm even telling the truth. As soon as it triggered a certain point of interest, that's where they go to work no matter what.
Because it's what I'm trying to get at is that if somebody is talking through their hat and they have nothing of value to say, they don't get into gear.
Oh, no.
They don't bother. They don't bother with people that really don't have anything to say.
No, those people are actually serving their overall purpose.
But when you have somebody gaining traction who has something to say, and they know it.
Well, most UFO accounts don't make it to the public, and I don't, like I said, I don't consider my account a UFO account. It's all IFO. But most don't make it to the public, and this account sure stands a high likelihood
of making it to the public.
And so they're going to be targeting.
And they don't want it to make it to the public, or they want it to make it in such a way that it would be fractured. And it's our obligation, our objective, to make sure that it gets intact.
Well, see, that's one thing that they actually suggested, and not they, but people whom have fallen under the influence of that group being possibly, having any redeemable value at all. And then it was suggested to me, well, maybe you should go through this reptile account, this Project Serpo account, and actually evaluate it. And I said, no, I don't want to evaluate nonsense.
No.
I know that it didn't happen. I know that it's nonsense. I have heard different modules for disinformation, and that is one of the spins that I heard years ago for disinformation. So when it popped up and I heard about it, I knew exactly what it was, and that's why I could easily just say, well, the next one's going to be this
or that.
It's going to be DROPO, and which stands for Operational Order. So the next one is going to be DROPO. Then they're probably going to relate that to the Dropa stones and say that's where that comes from. It is, and I labeled this word on it. It's bullshit.
Yes.
So that's where it sets. What are we gonna?
Well, we have enough time to talk about getting suited up to go and see the J-Rod, or possibly discussing a little bit about Majestic.
Very little, okay. I know what people want. I also know
then
I've got
people want what
parameters.
They want, and then there are things that we can talk about.
The basic procedure, if you will, we would meet on the level 4 in the briefing room, and if we had samples which needed to be removed from the J-Rod, the A and B team would be picked. The A team is the actual person who does the introduction into the clean sphere, with a single helper standing behind him until he gets into the gantry. And the B team handles anything else which is required on the floor at the time.
Okay.
It's a backup team. If I was, for instance, picked to do the introduction, which I had several, I would then proceed straight down the hallway, past all of the biocontainment levels, and down in the elevator to the floor, and walk down the stairs to the actual floor where the clean sphere would be either being raised up or already being positioned. There was a physician and a nurse who would check me out, do a general evaluation on me, breathe in, breathe out. And
was this at the clean sphere, or is this
right
in a
around
separate,
the corner from it?
in a separate room?
Yes, right around the corner to the right. And then you would walk out between the area which would be the overlook over the clean sphere and the wall that was actually set up with the equipment for the samples to head up. But I would be given an EKG, set up on a heart monitor. The leads would go to the equipment pack, which would be strapped around me after I was suited. I was catheterized and plugged, which was the most uncomfortable portion of the whole operation, next to the helmet. They had only limited numbers of suits which were available. They're extremely expensive moon suits. Basically, we're talking not a level 4 biocontainment positive pressure suit. We're talking a spacesuit for all intents and purposes. I would be put in a special jumper, and this is after the plugging and the catheterizing. In other words, I was stripped down. And after the jumper, I would be suited. The suit had a central feature, which would wrap around my torso and be locked and zipped around my torso. Then separate legs and separate arms would be added on with swivel locks. Then I would essentially be in an entire moon suit. the boots to the moon suit didn't separate. It was part of the actual leg, which would be locked and hooked on. Then I would have the helmet locked over the top, which just looked like a bell with a halo, if you will, a heavy rubberized halo stuck up into the top of the bell. And I would be checked out with with pressure. I'd be pressurized. After that worked, I would be depressurized, the helmet would be taken off, and I would have my communications gear put on, and then bell back on, relocked, and repressurized. At that point, I would be walked with my other A person out onto the floor in front of the clean sphere. By then, I could already see the J-rod over in the corner, and we were giving each other mental waves at the time. I should probably explain that we were not supposed to be communicating whatsoever, but as soon as I got out on the floor near the clean sphere, we were in communication with one another.
Really unknown to
the crew.
The crew.
Then walked up the gantry, which was placed in position to an interlock device on the side of the clean sphere, and walked up to the top and put into the little room almost. It's almost like a closet. There I would then hook up to the secondary oxygen system, which was able to be swiveled in a beveled area at the front of the gantry, so that when I entered into the clean sphere, I was actually hooked to the central portion of the gantry area. I would pressurize myself up, and when I was comfortable with the oxygen flow, the atmospheric flow, I would then decouple myself from the external device that I walked in with. Why we had to pressurize up before getting into the gantry was because if there was a failure of the system before I would be hooked in on the inside of the clean sphere, that I could potentially have nothing to breathe until they could get me out, so I could suffocate.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I was previously hosed up, as they called it.
So when
they joke, where there was jokes that was going on, they were going on the floor. You know, who gets hosed over tonight? Those sort of jokes, and that's what we called it when we actually rotated the drum inside. Is we would say, okay, I'm hosed over. That's what the joke was on the floor. So we would then pressurize up the atmosphere on the inside of the gantry, and then the door would be opened. I would then rotate the drum over, and I would manually close the door from top to bottom. It was a rotating, it actually opened this way, not sideways. And I would manually close the door, and then they would check to make sure that the interlock pressure in that gantry was made normal, that there was no leaking. Once I was introduced into the clean sphere, I would have my equipment with me, and there was a secondary hose which came out of the bottom by the gantry area, but it was fixed as part of the clean sphere, that the B unit would then be hooking up to transfer the samples up to the third floor. It wouldn't go initially up to the fourth floor where you would run the samples. They would go up to the third floor where the culture was actually held. And then they would be run back down to the fourth floor when we were working in the biocontainment laboratories. We would then hook the back of the PINS tube, which was a port, if you will, to our PINS system, our aspirative avulsion system. That acted as the drawing pressure for the needle. The next thing that I was supposed to do immediately after that was shuffle 2 steps to my right, and I was to raise my right hand. At the same time, projected as a teleprompter into the clean sphere's glass was a picture of a human being holding his hand up, and Sigma-approved symbols that this was a message of friendship. Well, I would go through this. I went through it the first time, And as I did it the first time, he asked me, "Why are you doing that?" Now, I was not able to verbally answer him, but I looked at him and I said, "Because I'm told to in here."
Yeah.
And he would go like that. He was actually laughing. That was his way of laughing. After the J-Rod would accept the offer for friendship, which would be his hand being raised up. And finally, it almost got to the point where you'd go, you have to know his behavior to know how flippant he was being, because he had very controlled behaviors.
I see.
And he would raise his little 4 digits up, and then I would be permitted then to walk from my position to him and carry out my duties, which he had been previously told what the duties were for that particular introduction. The bottom line is, as I was walking toward him, he was saying, "So you're going to remove sample from right appendage?" And I'd say, "Yes, sir." And while we were getting to know each other, he told me his private name, and I told him my name, and he wanted to learn about me, and he showed me a little bit about his growing up in Reticulum, and the beanie.
Mm-hmm.
The beanie line came up because he wanted to know some things from my childhood, and I recalled a favorite cartoon, which was Cecil, the seasick sea serpent.
And Beanie.
And Beanie Boy.
Beanie Boy.
And so I replayed a little bit for him in my head what I remembered from one of the episodes was Cecil yelling, "I'm coming, Beanie Boy," to help Beanie out. And so he started calling me BNE because he separated his words that way,
right,
naturally, from his actual learning of English from us. So he called me BNE most of the time. He didn't call me Dan or Danny or my childhood nickname all the way up to now, Boo Boo. He didn't. I told him those things, but I shared those things with him, but he called me BNE. And part of the reason why he, I think, associated with me as BNE is because the B team, when the B team was on the floor, Polly was there, and I looked over my shoulder one time, and Polly used to wear a hat with a beanie, and I actually have the propeller hat from him. Yes. He subsequently passed away during an accident up at the facility, but anyway, I looked over my shoulder, and he said, "Beanie that," and I looked over my shoulder, and I told him no, because Polly had a beanie hat that had a bill on the front of it, and the beanie hat that I was thinking about, that I was showing him from Beanie Boy,
just
was just a cap with the propeller. And so we had that discussion. Now, what I had with me in my case, depending upon the number of samples to be removed in locations, and that was established in briefing before I would ever come down onto the floor. I had it rehearsed, and we had to physically go through a rehearsal of what we were going to do. And that was filmed and recorded, so if we deviated from the procedures, everybody would know. So the only deviation I had from any of the procedures was actually, aside from falling over backward at one time, and that was his deviation, not mine, because he stepped toward me.
He stepped toward you.
And he was not supposed to. The only deviation was the actual conversations, the personal relationship that I had with him. In any case, let's say I had one sample to remove, which never happened. It was always multiples. I had a measuring device with me, and I would measure the area on his upper appendage and actually mark it off with my thumb, using my thumb, for lengths down the arm and the position on either the biceps or going down into the brachioradialis, where a lot of the samples were removed. And these sample removals were not chosen by us. They were chosen by the committee above us, by the cover committee. So we were being told, and they were interacting with the wise men up there. And we were basically told, you will evaluate what we give you to evaluate. So we evaluated that on our own, in our own style, of course, but we were told what we were going to be evaluating. It wasn't a situation of, well, I could make a call and try to get a sample from this location. No, we were told explicitly. Well, what I would do then is I would remove one of the vials. They were pressurized vials from the kit, and make sure that it was matching the area that I would have a sample removal from. Then I would add that vial into the top of my pins gun. It looked almost like a needle gun. And I would snap the vial down into the front of the pins gun, where the front of the vial would then be penetrated by the needle, the inside of the needle.
Yes.
And the front of the needle was not uncapped at that point. It was actually set where it was sealed. The next thing that I would do is I would snap the back of the needle into the back of the port, which would, there was an actual back of it had a rear entry point as well. And that was hooked to the pressurization unit. And I would close the top of the pin system. As soon as I would close the top of the pin system, I would then open the valve to the pressurization unit, which would cause the pull of the sample. After that, once I knew where the needle introduction would go, I would break the tip of the needle off.
Break the tip of the needle off.
It was a metal needle, and it was serrated. It was crimped, if you will. So I would actually break the tip of the needle off, and that for the first time would then open up the port to the front of the vial. I would then insert into the appropriate location in the into the J-rod the needle. After I would insert the needle, I would then squeeze the needle gun, and when I would squeeze the needle gun, what that would do is it would allow from the back of the needle, there was a pressurization valve at the back of the needle. It would then open up the back of the needle's pressurization valve right before the little tube for the sample. It would open that up to the outside. Once it opened that up to the outside, meaning now inside of the J-rod, that would then open up the pressurization pulling this direction, and it would only do it for a moment. So I would squeeze it, it would click inward, and it would open and close. When it would open and close, that would cause the pressurization to suck backward, and it would suck a small amount of tissue into the vial. So that was the actual pin system. It was called a pressurized induction needle system.
Was it a single needle?
It was a single needle. Okay. It was a single needle. They had other systems, multiple barrels, but we never used them. There were protocols for it, but maybe they were done on him, I don't know, but I never did. I never did. And what I mean by a barrel, it almost looked like a pepper box for multiple removals. And there were pin systems for that as well. Now, once that sample was removed, then I had to step back, remove the needle from the J-rod, step back and lock the pressurization off, open the system up, and actually remove the sample. Okay. I would then take the sample over to that little induction area, and I would pop the sample into the induction area, the vial, if you will, and then the B officer on the floor for the backup unit would then turn a switch, causing that sample to then be sucked to the outside of the clean sphere. It was sucked into another container. Then that entire container was then moved to the sort of thing you run into at a bank.
At a bank, where they send your thing up.
Exactly so. They would then send that up to the third floor, up to culture. Okay? And they had a total series of protocols up in culture. They had a bio-level 4 containment unit in the corner of the culture area across from the dissection and autopsy area. And that would then be handled in a glove box and then moved from that glove box, because there were induction ports in the side of the glove box, to sample containers for culture, and then that could be then sucked back down to the 4th level into BL4.
For examination.
For examination in the cabinet lab.
Now, we're talking about a small sample of living tissue.
Yes, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to just follow one sample. There were multiples which were removed
Right.
and then handled from 4 or 5 up to 3 and then back down to 4.
Down to 4. But we're talking about a sample of tissue that is alive. So that's one of the reasons it had to be handled so carefully.
And rapidly.
And rapidly.
That's exactly so. Now, these vials did not have any culture media in them whatsoever, the PINS vials that we added to our PINS guns. So they had to be in a cabinet. They had to be removed from the vial and actually placed into a growth media for evaluation and marked, and there were personnel setting up on floor 3 that just did that job. They were the sample handlers. They were culture experts is what they were. And they had the protocols which were already set up ahead of time for what size sample was to be placed in what variety of culture.
When
Because you have specialized enhanced culture media and selective growth.
Selective growth media. When you removed the sample and removed the needle from his arm, was there any exudate? Did he bleed? What did it look like?
It looked red and white, and usually the white material was some of his internal muscle material, or it was usually a little bit of muscle material that would squirt out. I never covered him over, so I imagine any of the cleansing of the area and all of that was done prior to him either being brought up to the 4th level, the clean sphere level, or after it was done, he would have been taken care of down in the ambassadorial suite. But there was never a protocol where I would cleanse him or anything like that.
Like swabbing before we would get a needle
right.
injection.
He would bleed, and the reason why, to be honest with you, the reason why the majority of the time that we had a small avulsion come out of the hole was because of the rapidness, the rapid pace that I was having to keep to get the samples. We were told work quickly. Do not worry about the pain. Get your sample and get the hell out, is what we were being told. And the reason why that was to decrease the amount of exposure time, and not physical exposure time, but psychological exposure time. The physical exposure, there was no physical exposure. But there was usually a little bit of whitish gray fluid.
I find that kind of hard to visualize because for us, muscles are massive and they don't leak.
Well, the tissue that the J-rod, which the J-rod is composed, is substantially less dense than a present-day human being. Okay. They are substantially more gelatin-like. I can put it that way.
Okay. But yet the muscles function as muscles and the connective tissue functions as connective tissue.
They do.
But it's more gelatinous.
It was not meant to be in our gravitational.
But it had a different texture and different composition.
Indeed it did. And the majority of the time there would be some bleeding, but that was it. These were no larger, the induction ports, the induction needles were no larger than, most of the time, than slightly larger than an insulin syringe.
Very small.
What we would use. Very small.
So the sample itself that was taken was very small.
It depends on I could take approximately a tenth of a cubic centimeter on a removal, up to a cubic centimeter, depending upon how long I would hold and refire it, because I could refire it.
Okay. So as you squeeze the gun.
Yeah. So we not only had different injection protocols for where we were supposed to site on the appendage of the J-rod, but we also had numbers of samples to be removed from a particular location.
So each time you would squeeze the triggering mechanism, and you would
about a tenth cc,
create the pressure through the needle that would draw up the tissue. You could squeeze it repeatedly to get more tissue
Yes.
if you needed more for that particular sample.
Yeah, and
to
we were told
fulfill-
how much per sample to remove.
remove.
Yeah. What I was trying to do is just follow a simple, basic technique from start to finish.
I
And that's why
understand.
wanted to-
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to.
No.
Okay.
Well, you brought out a good point. I mean, the people are going to want to know that it was done, under repetition, not just single removal per vial. But it depended on what we were instructed to do.
I understand.
In a couple of occasions, there were single removals, but the vast majority of them, there were multiples. What we would then do after a single removal is we would remove now there was a block in the back, a pressurized block in the back of the sample vial. So as the pressure was pulled the sample inward, it wouldn't get past it into the tube. It was a one-way filter system.
Okay.
So the pressurization, the actual suction pressure, that portion of the tube stayed clean. And there was HEPA filtering, virus filtering past it. So if we removed something then and there was any sort of an airborne virus involving the extraterrestrial, it would not have been aspirated into the system. Had it have been aspirated into the system and it would have been known, then there would have been a biocontainment problem and we wouldn't have had to worry about it anyway.
No, because the solution to that kind of a problem.
They feed gas into the room and then they ignite the gas.
And they ignite the gas.
That's right. And that's what the blow-off valves are for when the construction of this facility is
the pressure blow-offs.
Put to certainty by the artist who's working on it.
Yes.
In any case, we would get rid of the vial, and it would be sent up, moduled up to culture 3, and then I would have to remove the front of the pins needle, exchange it out, exchange the medium system out because there was a filter in between that as well that would go over the top of it. So all I had to do is pull there were little top vials, like there were like tubes over the top and over the bottom that would actually fit into. We're going to probably have to have the artist draw it. Fit into the front of the vial itself.
Okay.
And a filter in there as well, so that the contamination was relegated only to the needle system and inside of the vial itself.
Okay.
All right, meaning the sample was contained in the vial, but we call it a contamination because that's where the substance actually was, the potentially exotic substance. And so I would tear the front of the needle down, basically, put a new one on, and go through the same system again by removing the front of the needle and removing whatever the sample protocol was from the J-rod. Once done, the sample material, the actual used up needles, the Sharpies basically, would remain in my case and would remain inside of the clean sphere after I would leave.
The case would remain inside of the clean sphere.
Yes. I would not walk out of there with the case that I walked in with.
I was going to say, yes, that makes sense.
The next thing that would happen is we would go from 1 over to 2, because I had a communications system on. It was like a harness belt around me with a communication system, and I would advise that the ECE contact was completed, and they would tell me, okay, you can wait by the door, meaning the inner door, and I would back myself. I was actually supposed to step slowly backward away from the J-rod so as not to scare the J-rod. Slowly backward, so I would follow the protocol, and I would walk backward to the door, and I would wait, and then I would be told, fine, the center was then repressurized, and I could then unlock the door and open it up. Now there was an electronic lock on the inside of that door. It was set electronically, so if I tried to get out myself early, no go. I could not have left. But once approved, then I could step back into the center area. Now comes the tricky protocol. how in the hell am I going to get out from the inside of the containment area with my suit? Because I've been in contact with what?
Exactly. Potentially exotic material.
I didn't. The drum would get moved back over. I would then rehook into the external air, and the other hoses would be dropped right there, just left on the inside of the clean sphere, and the door would be locked. Now I'm in this little
cubby
area. The gantry would be pulled back. The bolts would be removed from the steps to go up to the gantry, and the scissor mechanism would be brought down, so I would actually be brought down in a container. That container was then pushed over. Now I'm breathing external environment. That container would then be pushed over to the outside wall area outside of decon, which is the area where I was first plugged and all of that business. The top of the container would then be cleaned with a rag over a port.
Mm-hmm.
A tube would then be pulled from the wall, large hose, if you will, up above me now. I'm standing there and I'm breathing the outside air. Well, it was pressurized. It was a separate system. It was a highly controlled and a separate positive pressure system. But outer air, meaning not inside of the clean sphere anymore. Mm-hmm. And the entire area that I was standing in would be filled, liquid. And there I would stand for 15 to 20 minutes, move around, and I was in a bathing liquid. It was a decon facility. Then a hose would be added to the side of this gantry area, and it would be flushed. That would then go off to a biocontainment, and I do not know how they disposed of the liquid. We were never told. We were just told that it was disposed of appropriately. Anything that was alive in there wouldn't have been alive. And then I was allowed out of the gantry. It was unlocked. I was allowed out of the gantry, and then I was slowly depressurized in the suit and allowed out of the suit. From there, I went through a medical examination. I had blood removed. I had to do the coughing, and they'd listen, and doing the thumping on my lungs, the auscultation, I think it's called, and then I would be allowed to debrief. From there, I would go up to one of the briefing rooms in back of the gallery, which was overlooking the clean sphere. And they had briefing rooms that were set in back of the gallery. I would then go through a debriefing, not that different from what this scenario is, and I would indicate where I had a problem with the removal, and I was supposed to fully debrief as to what occurred between myself and the J-Rod. And I gave about that much of it. And they knew it. And they didn't really push on me or anything like that, though. From there, I would then be taken up to level 4, back to the debriefing room, past the air curtains, back to the Aquarius debriefing room, and that is where we would plan what we were going to do with the samples which were removed. And sometimes we would immediately then get resuited up, go back through decon from 1 down to our pretend 4, or we would leave. And the samples were held for culture and allowed to be cultured up in level 3 before they would be brought down to 4 for microscopy or manipulation. So that gives you a pretty good idea what it was like. But everything was completely contained where nothing could get out into the environment. And it always gave me a freaky feeling when they would fill up the gantry, because I wondered what that liquid was. I knew that we were told it was a disinfectant.
But you wondered what it was.
And it was clear.
It was transparent.
It was transparent, but it was too viscous for normal water. Mm-hmm. It wasn't water with as a universal solvent or anything like that with something diffused into it. It was thick. It wasn't as thick as mineral oil, but it was somewhere between a light mineral oil and alcohol.
Okay.
And they gave the name, I'm sure, somewhere along the line what the name of it was, but I couldn't give couldn't
Right.
have cared.
But moving around, it didn't affect you because you were self-contained.
I was self-contained with a positive pressure going to that separate pressure unit from the outside of the clean sphere, not the clean sphere's pressure unit. And so there has to have been at least 3 separate positive pressure systems down there on that level. One for the gallery level to walk around and to walk around the clean sphere. One inside of the clean sphere that led out of the clean sphere for our positive pressure, and one to the gantry.
To the gantry itself.
Right. And I don't know what the schematics look like, what the pressure systems look like around the rooms we were in. I have no idea about that. I know it worked though. Yeah. It never failed when I was in there or anything like that. The only thing that failed when I was in there was me and falling backwards, and it only happened once.
You caught your foot, didn't you, on part of the grating?
I still like this vision of it, of me standing there and doing everything right, and then him leaping in a mad gesture across the room. It didn't happen. I went to walk toward him. And he decided to step toward me as a joke. Now, when we would walk toward the J-rod, I should explain that we were supposed to do so almost in a cadence like a "Here Comes the Bride" stepping,
and
single
a pause,
step.
And a single
That's
step,
right.
And then a single step.
Yes, we did not just walk across the floor, this graded floor. Well, I did a step toward him and nothing. I did a second step toward him, and he did a step toward me, which was way out of bounds. It scared me so bad I stepped backward, and the grating on the floor was such that the side port to the clean sphere where the gantry would hook to, the grating was not parallel with the face of the doorway to enter into the clean sphere. It was off canter a bit.
Okay.
And it was more in line with where we were standing for the identification procedure. So when I stepped backward, I was drawing a perpendicular line to the direction of the grating as I would step backward. And so the grating was right up against my heels. And I think it was my right heel that I stumbled with. But I know that it was either my right heel or my left heel, because my other foot then got tangled up because I began to panic, simply because I never felt myself get stuck like that before in there. And I had him stepping forward at
the
me.
same time.
At the same time, and I panicked. And when I panicked, I fell over backward onto the pressurization pouch, which contained the filters for the suit. And I had a hard time getting up, so I was kind of laying there, like I said, I was laying there like Dr. Vinkman that had been slimed in Ghostbusters, and kind of doing the weird cockroach routine, laying on my back. And he continued to step forward, and I didn't know it at that moment. And I had placed my hands to my sides because I was trying to set myself up. I had, at that point, my A person outside the gantry saying, Dan, are you okay? Dan, are you okay? When that was happening, I then had surveillance coming over and saying, what's the nature of the anomaly? They thought I had been hurt.
Mm-hmm.
That he may have said something to me or directed some sort of entrainment toward me and harmed me, that I was under attack in essence. And I heard them saying something like, we're going to thump the repress. And I said, no, because what would have happened is I would have been fine. The pressurization on the outside of me would have changed. He would have been hurt.
Oh, yes.
They were going to intumesce him.
They were going to intumesce him to stop him.
They
thought
and
he
if
was
necessary,
attacking.
they could have killed him.
Right.
And that's one thing that, before I go on what he did, that's one thing that was always, I never agreed with the bioethics or the morality of the issue. they were willing, knowing who he was, knowing that he was another human being, they were willing to sacrifice him for my life.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that. And the reason why I don't agree with that is this was the ambassador. I was the technician. And my life is no more precious than his. And he was here on special circumstances. What we were learning from him was vastly more important than what he was learning from us. So I disagreed with that ethic. But that ethic was cemented in there. And that's why I said, no, 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 laying on my back trying to set up.
Yeah.
Because they were saying, you know, we'll go ahead and repress him. And he must have continued forward toward me while they were saying that. And I don't think he was able to hear what they were saying.
Okay.
And that's something I never spoke with him about, come to think of it. I never spoke with him about whether or not he could hear
their plan to...
their communications going over my... But at the same time, I figure he probably heard through my auditory sensors because he was thumping me constantly. I mean, you could feel it. It was like... when you were getting close to him.
You're shaking.
Was I there?
You're shaking. You okay?
Yeah, that is what
Yes.
I'm
Yes.
experiencing thinking about it. And as I was saying, no, 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 I kind of half sat up, and then I felt his hand touch me on my chest, and I felt him pull himself up onto me. So he was actually setting on me. He climbed up on top of me. Now I heard all hell break loose over the radio system. 2 was walking over 1, because whenever 2 would clip on, it would take precedence over, it would supersede the first channel, which contained the floor units, the beta units, you know, the B team, the backup team, and the gallery observers. And that basically went to security and the wise men and any brass. And I'm not talking about generals brass, I'm talking about real brass, magi personnel that were there, had control over that. No offense to the military. But anyway, I don't want to start an inner...
No. Just...
The military inside the facility did not have juice over the top of the magi. We'll put it to you that way. We ran the facility. And the security for them ran it for them. And I say we because of the short period of time that I had a number, and I'm supposed to say it that way. We ran the facility.